Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Kim Churches, and I'm the CEO of AAUW. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's Equity Network webinar around imposter syndrome and how to achieve radical self-acceptance when our workplace norms, our paradigms and systems are really set up in such a homogenous way that people of color and women of color don't always feel that they can belong and participate fully, wholly, and authentically in the workplace. And we'll be talking a lot about what imposter syndrome is, how you can see the signs of it, and what you too can do in steps to eradicate it from our workplaces so all can thrive and achieve their goals and aspirations. But I am truly honored tonight to welcome Dr. Lincoln Hill, who's joining us from Chicago to talk to us about this important subject. And this is really a part of an ongoing professional development series that we've been putting on since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, because what has happened in our workplaces since the pandemic is a giant illuminating spotlight on all of the inequities in our workplace and in our society. And particularly for women and women of color, we know we have been on the front lines in every single regard of this pandemic. And we've talked a lot about that in past webinars, but tonight is a really keenly important subject, whether we're in a pandemic or not. Because what we have seen in the pandemic, again, is just illuminating all that we knew, the inequities that were already there, the systems and practices from a far gone era of kind of homogenous cisgendered males, and how we actually changed the page, turned the page to the workplaces of 2020 and beyond, so all of us can thrive and live and work in ways that meet our skills and our aspirations. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Nakia McFarlane, my colleague here at AAUW, who will go through some of the housekeeping norms of how we'll go about ensuring that your voices are heard and that you're getting as much as you can out of tonight's terrific subject matter. Nakia.
And thank you all so much for joining us for another exciting Equity Network webinar. I'm Nakia, the Engagement Associate at AAUW. So this conversation is really important to me as someone who has dealt with their fair share of imposter syndrome. And I know it's important to you all as well, since many of you have asked us to cover this topic in your comments, in your emails, and in your survey responses. So thank you for sharing your feedback so that we can continue sharing content that is important to you and to your professional development. And now before we jump right in, I do want to cover some quick housekeeping for this webinar. Many of you are already familiar with how we format these sessions, but for those of you who are new, we do use the chat box for technical questions. So if you have any questions related to not being able to hear us properly or see us, just let us know in the chat box and we'll do our best to help you out. We use the Q&A box for substantive questions related to the discussion. So if you have any questions about the discussion at any point in time during the webinar for Dr. Hill, just direct those to the Q&A box. We will have some time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. And I can't promise that we'll get to all of your questions, but we will do our best to get to every single one before we close out at 6 p.m. Now joining us today is Dr. Lincoln Hill, and she is a postdoctoral fellow at the Chicago Counseling Collective and an adjunct faculty member in Loyola University Chicago's counseling program. Her clinical and research interests center on issues pertaining to Black women's mental health, the imposter syndrome, racial and ethnic minority college student development, intersectionality, multiculturalism, and social justice. So Dr. Hill is a powerful voice on the imposter syndrome and how it intersects with issues of racism and sexism. So I'm really excited that she's here with us today as we hold space for this really important conversation. So Dr. Hill, thank you so much for joining us. And Kim will be kicking us off with the very first question.
Great. So Dr. Hill, what Nakia and I are hoping for is some stage setting here so you can kind of give us a sense of the subject matter and what we're talking about tonight. So let's talk a little bit about what is the imposter syndrome or the imposter phenomenon, what causes it, what does it look like for people who are experiencing it in the workplace?
Absolutely. So this term imposter phenomenon was coined in the 70s by two researchers and clinicians who started to notice that people, one in their social groups, despite being objectively competent, tended to have trouble really internalizing their achievements, despite being really high achieving. So they started to develop the study kind of based around that to kind of understand what is this thing that we're actually seeing and how do we actually understand it. So they realized that these people tend to be high achieving, they tend to discount themselves, they tend to view success as strokes of luck, and they're often really worried about being outed as frauds to people who are important to them. So that could mean like their peers, their coworkers, but also those people who are in authority positions above them. And those initial studies kind of looked at some of the mechanisms that kind of explain how this happens. And some things they were looking at were like our family systems. So maybe if you're in a family where you're given compliments just indiscriminately, so if you do anything, it's like, you're amazing, you're so good, congratulations, then people kind of had a tough time kind of accepting those compliments. They're like, is it really, did I do something actually miraculous? Or is this just my parents maybe just giving me like feedback constantly about positive things? People are also seeing that maybe the way that they were told from their parents about maybe being charming, or it's because people like you that you got that A. It's you got that job because that person is my friend, etc. So they started to maybe externalize their achievements in that way. Like, it's not really like my worth, it's because I'm socially competent, it's because people like me, it's because I'm attractive, etc. And there were all these different ways that it was like developed kind of in those early childhood years, and it would show up especially in adulthood as they started to kind of pursue academic careers and as they started to pursue more of the workforce. So some of the ways that it can be maintained is through hard work by itself. So if I believe that I am internally a fraud, that I don't really belong somewhere, then I'm going to work so much harder to prove that I belong. So if I get a task or a project at work and I don't feel like I'm supposed to be competent enough to be able to do it, I'm going to work extra hard, I'm going to put in long hours, and I'm going to end up probably doing really well on the task at hand. And other people are going to tell me that I did really well, but internally I'm like, well, I only did really well because I worked so hard to prove that I was competent. And I'm not really, though. So that cycle continues over and over and over again. And you continue reaching all these achievements and all these objective successor markers, but you're not really going to be able to internalize it. Again, people may discount themselves by saying, oh, my boss likes me, that's why I keep getting put on projects, or I keep getting promoted, etc. And again, externalizing that. And then there's some people who also can understand that social messages kind of explain why we might feel that way too. And for this original study, they looked mostly at white women, like white women who were middle to upper class and who were in kind of like higher education spaces or like higher professional categories. But they realized that maybe there's this kind of socialization messaging that's kind of going on, that's telling women that, yeah, you're able to be in these kind of high achieving positions, but only if you feel like you don't belong there. So it's almost like a trade-off. So that's kind of how they kind of believe that to be. And they initially thought, the initial researchers, they initially thought that it was only women who experienced this and that it wasn't men. Just because historically men are more likely to internalize success and externalize failures, whereas women are often socialized to externalize success and internalize failures, right? So they kind of thought that there was something there, even though subsequent research has maybe shown that men can also experience imposter phenomenon. But what I was always interested in was, how do we understand why different groups of people feel like imposters, and how does the outside world kind of explain that and then kind of enforce messages we feel about ourselves internally?
Yeah. Go ahead, Nakia.
So, have you ever dealt with imposter syndrome in your field? And if you have, what would you tell your younger self about imposter syndrome now?
That's a good question. Yes, absolutely yes. I remember probably first starting even college or even applying to college. That's when I first started to feel it. Despite having been really successful in school up to that point, again, like having all those teachers and like even my peers, like knowing I could do something, it was really hard for whatever reason to internalize it. And I would always call that feeling just self-doubt. Like, I didn't have language for imposter phenomenon or imposter syndrome, but I just knew that I would doubt myself. And I knew that there were moments where I would aim high, but I didn't maybe aim as high as I wanted to actually aim, because I was afraid that if I did really kind of go for what I wanted and I failed, then that would say something about me. And then I would feel like inferior. I'd feel like there was something wrong with me. So definitely, I think through those early years, and even more so whenever I entered my PhD program, like that constant worry of like, oh, what if they made a mistake? What if I'm not supposed to be here? So every assignment felt that much bigger. It wasn't just an assignment that was meant to be challenging because I'm in this kind of this new field of study, but it's also feels more challenging because I feel like I have to prove that I belong. And it's hard to just be a student and to allow yourself to be open to learning when you feel like you constantly have to prove that you belong or that you're worthy of something. So I did a lot of work of self-work and understanding like where those messages came from. When did I first remember feeling that way? And what about my environment is, again, reinforcing this idea that I don't belong or that I'm not supposed to be there. So I know for me, when I became more critically minded, started to like critiquing these systems that I was a part of, then I was able to externalize some of that inferiority complex, I guess I could call it, not imposter syndrome. So yeah, I think if I had a message for younger me, it would be to think about that. Think about these systems that you're a part of. Think about why it was so easy for me to internalize those things rather than think critically and explore how these systems make other people feel, not just me. And maybe think about, again, that self-doubt as not being something that is fully my responsibility or fully belongs to me, but there might be systems in the world that want me to feel like I don't belong, that want me to doubt myself. That felt really important. Yeah, and that I don't maybe have to internalize or swallow a lot of that oppression and toxicity that exists kind of in the world. It doesn't have to be a part of how I see myself. And to me, that's really radical. We're talking about radical self-acceptance and really compassionate. And I had to learn that. I had to practice that. But that can be really hard whenever you're kind of thrown into these environments that are often really harsh.
Yeah, boy, that's a lot right there to unpack, Dr. Hill. I mean, that's a lot. And that's a lot of work to constantly, I'm sure, even today, I can have feelings of imposter syndrome and feeling like perhaps it's just luck that's gotten me to where I am, or a boss that liked me, or a mentor, or whatever. But exactly to your point of, this is a really good segue to the next question, which is, we're 20 years into the 21st century, right? You would think that we could be able to avoid kind of these Norman Rockwellian images of the past of what the workplace looks like, what professionalism looks like. And those power systems and paradigms really typically still today show images of success for white cisgendered males. So let's talk a little bit how racial and gender discrimination plays into the imposter syndrome, what that really means for people of color, particularly when white men are so overrepresented in positions of power. And so they're, kind of controlling the systems and paradigms of, what does professionalism look like? What does it take to get ahead in the workplace, regardless of industry or sector? So how does that all interplay? And how are we still in 2020 dealing with these systems and paradigms?
Absolutely. I think something I often like to mention and kind of set the stage for is understanding that so many of these systems, systems of work, of education, et cetera, were designed and historically designed to be exclusive and to be only accepting of a certain type of person. So we can't just say at one point, because of maybe changes in law or policy, that now we're going to just welcome everyone and they're going to feel welcome, they're going to feel invited, it's going to be inclusive now just because we said it was, without actually interrogating and investigating what are the structures that still kind of maintain this desire for a certain person to be accepted and to feel good about themselves when they enter certain spaces. So that's really important. So there hasn't really been much acknowledgement or atonement for that, like the ways that these systems kind of perpetuate oppression and how people within these systems who maybe don't fit that cis, straight, white, male norm can continue to feel unwelcome and continue to feel poorly about themselves, right? There's really no acknowledgement of that. And I think now with like terms like microaggressions and kind of implicit bias kind of being used kind of in the mainstream now, people are kind of aware that oppression isn't always this completely overt thing that's in your face. But there's oftentimes these covert ways that people are basically told that they're not supposed to be there and that they don't deserve to be kind of taking up space in any way at all. And I think that is what the real work is when it comes to the imposter syndrome and when it comes to recognizing how discrimination of any kind of impacts how people actually end up feeling about themselves. And I don't think we've done a good job, or people in power haven't really done a good job of really interrogating that. Because I think it would be a whole like system shift and a whole change to what we know to be like very like US centric.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Hill. So when we're talking about sort of systems of discrimination that sort of perpetuate this idea that certain people don't belong in certain spaces, how do you see that as imposter syndrome in a person of color? How do you recognize that's what that feeling is, as opposed to just having a society tell you that constantly? Like, are those things separate?
That's a good point, because there are a lot of people who identify as people of color who don't necessarily feel like imposters. And that's okay too. But for people who do feel like imposters, again, despite having those objective markers of success and objective achievements, et cetera, I always like to kind of look at how they experience their environments. So I've worked a lot with college students in university college counseling. So for a lot of that, I like to ask questions about what are your experiences with oppression? Like basically, how critically minded are you? Like, are you aware of the stereotypes that might exist about you? Have you had experiences with microaggressions on campus? Like, how do you feel in your classes? Are you the only one who maybe shares some of those salient cultural identities? Again, what does it feel like whenever you're in these spaces? And that kind of gets to that sense of understanding of like, how might your environment be impacting, again, how you feel about yourself? Yeah, because there's a lot of studies now that are even showing it's not just the ability to endorse negative stereotypes about your group, but it's even just the understanding that those stereotypes exist. That's enough for you to have negative mental health outcomes and negative physical health outcomes as well. To know that other people may be judging you and maybe judging you unfairly based off of their own assumptions about you. It's almost like you constantly have to kind of be on guard and ready for that at all times. And that's kind of this other barrier that people are kind of dealing with. And sometimes it might be difficult to kind of externalize that. So you just kind of internalize it and swallow it. Yeah. Yeah, and some things that I specifically look for is like the inability to maybe accept compliments from other people, kind of completely discounting that or dismissing that or anything that might be positive about yourself. Discounting any markers of achievement I look at. If I notice some of your language might be kind of mimicking or internalizing some of those oppressive messages that you received, maybe saying like, I'm only here because they needed to fill a diversity quota. I'm not really as good as everyone else here. Like, I'm only here for this one purpose. If I hear those messages over and over again, then I might be thinking about this might be the imposter syndrome, and it might largely be shaped by how you've come to understand yourself within like oppressive systems and structures.
Yeah, these are great tips for recognizing the signs. We've either each felt it or we've seen it replicated, and there's also work not only in ourselves, recognizing it for ourselves, but also what we can do as leaders, as upstanders, as colleagues, to call that out and be able to really deliberately lay out why people should not, we hope will not be internalizing the imposter syndrome. So you mentioned before that it's not just women that take on the imposter syndrome, that men do as well, but that it impacts women more, just due to the basic discrimination in leadership positions. Just as a point of reference for folks out there, even in higher education, only about 30% of the positions are held by women, less than 5% by people of color. In Fortune 500, we're talking about roughly 7.5% of the leadership positions are held by women. So we've got huge leaps to do in leadership positions. So considering how various forms of discrimination can amplify the feelings of being an imposter, why aren't we centering these conversations more on women of color in mainstream conversations about imposter syndrome? We tend to do this in a macro lens, but not really focusing in on those that are impacted the most by the imposter syndrome. And why do you think that is? Why isn't it not part of mainstream conversation right now?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think that's where my dissertation research really came from, of really wanting to focus on like particularly Black women and how Black women experience this construct. So much research generally centers whiteness as the norm, right? So with that, anyone who doesn't fit into that is kind of pushed to the margins. And that's important to consider too. So much of at least social science research really wants to generalize results. So if you have a study that's looking at how women experience the imposter syndrome or how women experience anything, you're often going to be looking at white women, and we're often going to conflate those results to other women who don't identify as white too. So I think it just kind of mimics how society functions, of kind of pushing people who don't kind of identify with this kind of majority culture to the margins, to where we never really get a chance to understand the unique aspects of certain constructs or certain ideas. Right. So for my dissertation, it was really important to just completely center Black women, who are rarely centered in research generally, especially in psych research, and do a study understanding like how does this population experience the imposter syndrome? How does context, if at all, help explain it for different people, so that we're not again having these results that maybe don't have any cultural nuance or don't really apply to people who don't identify as white women and who don't maybe have the privileges of being white women in society. And that feels really important to me. But again, it just feels like how most things in our society are.
Yeah, sadly Sadly true. And so for everybody who's on tonight's webinar, once we get the recording up to, really encourage you to share it with others so we can start to change the mainstream conversations ourselves. We all have a responsibility of ways that we too can leverage this important discussion. Also, a reminder to you from the beginning here that if you've got questions or comments, please add them to the Q&A section. We will, as we kind of complete this fireside chat with Dr. Hill on this important subject, that will then be turning to the Q&A portion here to be able to really address your comments and questions in the second portion of this. Nakia, over to you.
Yeah, so you mentioned that that a lot of this kind of research doesn't really center Black women, even when it's clear that women of color are mostly impacted by things like the imposter syndrome. So it's partially the reason why we don't see the kind of solutions that would help those women of color either. And considering that your work is centered on centering Black women in this conversation, what advice do you have for Black women and for women of color who are dealing with the imposter syndrome?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things, right? So I think about like those micro level, like individual resources you can rely on, those individual things you can kind of work on, but then also, again, like those larger systemic things too. And I think so much of the imposter syndrome, when we think about tips, is really about like change your point of view, look at your resume, update it, which those things can be very helpful, but it really doesn't do anything to kind of make people adjust to a really unhealthy system that makes you sick, right? So how are we kind of targeting both of those things, those micro level interventions and those larger systemic interventions? So I think with the micro level, I think a lot about empowerment. Like how do we actually empower people in these positions that they're in that might, again, be kind of these oppressive dynamics? And some things that I think about with that are really kind of engaging in that self-compassion that I mentioned earlier whenever I was kind of on my own journey of discovery of battling the imposter syndrome. Self-compassion can be really, really challenging, especially when within the capitalistic society that we're in, where our value is often so closely tied to our output and our outcome, like what we do, what we can accomplish, et cetera. And I think for so many people, you try to outwork and outrun those insecurities and those deep-seated feelings you have about yourself. And then you're almost surprised when you're really high achieving and it's just not matching up the way that you externally present, but maybe the way you internally feel. And I think that's, again, kind of unlearning some of these things that have been really harmful for all of us in a lot of ways. And instead of maybe practicing the judgment about ourselves and towards ourselves, maybe kind of looking inwardly and thinking a lot about self-compassion and kindness, finding value in ourselves maybe outside of those markers so that we're not so reliant on kind of these external markers of success. So those are some of the micro level things. I think also thinking about when you actually feel affirmed, like when do you not feel like an imposter, and thinking about that and really stressing that too. So that might be around like-minded people, that might be affinity spaces, that might be a couple of people at work who you feel like you're able to uplift and support each other. And how do you create those communities for yourself? I think things that we've also talked about, and I talked about my dissertation, it's kind of like thinking about resilience, but from a cultural perspective, kind of like relying on those cultural strengths that you have. For my study, I looked at Black women, so thinking about like community, thinking about being critically engaged, critically minded, and then also thinking about self-esteem. Like where are we in spaces where people are able to kind of work on how they feel about themselves and again, feel good about themselves. And again, as far as those larger systemic levels, which I think are really important to mention, it's kind of having organizations that are actually invested in hiring and retaining women of color, that are interested in recruiting women of color, that are interested in holding people accountable for any instances of bias or discrimination, training people on biases and biases and implicit training and all of that. And I think also on a systemic level, thinking a lot about 360-degree evaluations, so that it's not maybe just the person who has less systemic power being the one who's kind of solely open up to people's evaluations of them, but you're able to also have these opportunities to share your feedback about the people who you work with or people who have power over you within the organization you're a part of. So those are some of the things that come to mind for me.
Ooh, really, really well said, and a lot to unpack there too. So You started getting into some of this, and I think this is a good thread to pull on a bit, and I'm seeing some of it in the Q&A section too. So, all of us have moments of doubt, but how can we kind of learn to think differently about our accomplishments when we are doubting what we're doing or doubting if it has real value at all? So, if we're trying to get to self-acceptance, even when all of us make mistakes. I made a mistake earlier on something today. We all do. That's human as we continue to grow and evolve and change, whether we're in the early years of education, in the workplace or beyond, and in all parts of society. So, how can we think about this? What are ways that we can think differently to kind of do those mind shifts to get to greater self-acceptance?
Absolutely. I think interrogating your belief system. Again, thinking about, and I'm going to use like myself as an example. For me, it was like, okay, well, if I get into this school, or if I get this fellowship, or if I get this thing, then I've made it, and I'm going to feel great about myself, and I will not feel like an imposter. But then, once you get to each stage, it kind of comes up again. Exactly, because you never really dealt with the actual thing that's underneath all of that stuff. And that was kind of naming my insecurity and being vulnerable enough to name that. And having trusted people around me, like really good friends, to be able to kind of process these things. And also having good supervisors who were able to hold that for me and also share their own vulnerable experiences, maybe when they were earlier in their careers or when they were grad students, and they didn't feel good about themselves, right? So being able to name that and have vulnerable spaces feels really important. So you can, again, take that kind of external focus away and move it more internal to you. I think, again, what I was saying as far as self-compassion and self-kindness feels extremely important. And I say this to my clients. I say this to people, the students I work with. I just say this to anybody who will listen, is it's really important to think about those messages that you give to yourself. Is your internal voice one that's critical and one that's really harsh towards yourself whenever you make a mistake? How do you acknowledge that and then maybe interfere with that and maybe offer something else that might be a little bit softer, that might be a little bit more gentle? Because I think so much of the world is already going to be harsh and critical towards us. So we have to kind of come to a safe place internally where we're able to be vulnerable even with ourselves. And we're able to maybe have a different internal experience than the one we might get in the outside world. So those are some of the things that I actively try to work on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Those are great notes for all of us to take to heart and incorporate in our daily lives. Nakia is going to ask our final question here, and then I'm going to start moving to the chats or to the Q&A, to the Q&A to go through a lot of the terrific questions that are coming through here so we can get through as many of them as we can while we're lucky enough to be with Dr. Hill this evening. So Nakia, take us home.
All right. So, Dr. Hill, I love that you mentioned that it's important for us to be gentle with ourselves, and that we do live in a world and exist in a world that is constantly telling all of us in different ways that we're not enough. So in a way, it is a radical thing to fully believe in yourself and to fully accept who you are as a person. So thank you so much for mentioning that it's okay to be gentle. You don't have to be so hard on yourself. And with that, I do want you to share sort of just some tips that you have for folks here today, and for me even, people who deal with imposter syndrome. Like, what advice do you have for the day-to-day when it comes to overcoming something that can be so large in someone's life, like imposter syndrome?
Absolutely. It has so many impacts and kind of ripple effects too, as it shows up. So yeah, I think again, some of those things I mentioned, again balancing kind of that internal work, but then also understanding that there's nothing really wrong with you. Like there's something wrong with the system. So I would maybe recommend start doing some of that work, being a little more critical conscious and critically minded, and start thinking about things on a systems level. So starting to maybe do a little bit more work and digging into intersectionality research. I know what really kind of started all this for me is at the American Psych Association convention. I think this was 2016. Kimberly Crenshaw was there, and she did this amazing speech, and just put so many thoughts and experiences that I'd had into this beautiful presentation. And it was really validating, and it kind of legitimized so much of what I'd been experiencing throughout my entire life. And it gave me this framework again of thinking about what are these larger systems that make me want to feel a certain way and make me kind of feel down on myself and make me want to be kind of mean to myself. How do I understand that? How do I kind of use this language to be able to be more critically minded and more conscious to be able to move out of that? I think that was really helpful. So that's not to say that those feelings don't come up or that imposter syndrome doesn't present itself at all for me. It does, but it means that I'm better able to challenge that with compassion and with kindness for myself, and to understand that I'm not, again, the only one who's feeling that way. And even in my dissertation research, whenever people were responding about their experiences with the imposter syndrome, again, there was this idea that I'm the only one. No one else feels this way. Everyone else is completely competent. I'm the only one. And there's so much that's isolating about feeling like maybe you're the only one. And if you feel that way because of the imposter syndrome, but if you also feel that way because maybe you're the only woman of color in your organization or your department, it's even further isolating. So again, with that, I would stress highly finding community of people where you can feel vulnerable, people who do affirm you and affirm your work, not just for those external achievements that you have, but also just for the person that you inherently are internally. That's really important. And again,
Well said. I would, I'm going to buckle together a couple of the first two questions here for you, Dr. Hill, because I think they're so interrelated. And one is from somebody who says that they feel like they have all or almost all of the qualifications that an employer is looking for. And they need to have that before they feel confident to apply, but now starting to apply for some positions where maybe they've got 75% of the qualifications and a lot of angst about that. I mean, I will say in our own research, we've really seen this so much in males versus females, of knowing that women tend to want to be able to be at 110%. Men go, if I've got like 70% of it, I'm good to go. I'm going to apply for that and I'll figure out the rest of it, on the way. So folks are wondering if that's a bit of imposter syndrome. And then the follow-up to that is somebody who has said, does the imposter syndrome also explain why some people are overachievers? Even with success, they can't internalize their success. So how do you look at it in an organic way of competency for jobs you're applying for when you have this cloud of the imposter syndrome over you? And then how do you balance that with not overachieving so much that you're not getting some balance in your life too?
Absolutely. And I'm hearing also in that question, this idea of perfectionism, which is also closely linked. Right. If I am excellent, if I am perfect, then I am without critique. And if I'm without critique, then I'm going to be perfect for this job, et cetera. And I think a lot of that is also this fear of failure and rejection. Like, how do we actually internalize and interpret rejection? So say you apply for a job and you have 75% of the qualifications, the worst they could say is that you don't have the job. But again, when we talk about women and men, especially when it comes to internalizing success and externalizing failures, women may be more likely to internalize that failure into their self-image, as if there's something wrong with them, and that there's something inherently bad or something that they're inherently lacking, which is the reason why they didn't get the job. And I think sometimes the thing that comes with confidence is also understanding that if I don't get this job, it's not saying that I'm not a qualified person. It's not saying that I'm not worthy of a position. It's not saying that I'm not worthy of having the things that I want or I'm striving for in life. You're able to kind of differentiate and tease those things apart a little bit more easily, maybe when you've done that internal work a little bit. But I certainly get that, of this desire to be maybe over-prepared in interviews or over-prepared when it comes to your resume or your qualifications, as almost kind of a cushion and a net to make sure that you're protecting yourself from that sense of rejection or that failure. Yeah. And there also are some very real realities when we think about identity too. And I know especially like Black women, maybe feeling like it's not enough to just be good, you got to be amazing. You feel like you have to work twice as hard to get something too. So I want to name that and think about constantly those interactions. And it can be really difficult to tease apart. But again, I think it always goes back to that self-work and an understanding of your world critically.
Yeah, very well said. So here's another good one on wondering about how mentorship can be used to address imposter syndrome. So meaning other people besides just yourself, the work that you do yourself, but also the work of others. And this person says, that someone who is nearing 5 years in the workforce, I struggle combating imposter syndrome. So I guess I would ask you both, Dr. Hill, on mentorship and sponsorship as a valuable resources for folks who are trying to overcome imposter syndrome.
Sure, absolutely. I still get excited when my advisor and like the chair of my dissertation like gives me a compliment or just kind of affirms me in some way. Because usually mentors are people that you admire in some way or another, or who have maybe been in a position that you're hoping to be in. So there's a little bit of guidance in that way. So I think with mentors who are able to be vulnerable and to maybe validate your feelings, and even maybe if they can share their own experiences with the imposter syndrome, that can be really helpful. So for you to model, for them to model for you that you're not the only one who's experiencing something like this, but yes, even the people who you look up to can also experience this too, and probably are still experiencing it wherever they are in their careers as well. So I think that can be really helpful. Again, just having an affirming place where someone can remind you of who you are and of what you're capable of doing.
Yeah, and I'll just add on that. I mean, I think maybe, the affirming places are so key. If you're working in a large scale company or organization or institution, a lot of times we have, employee resource groups or affinity groups or BRGs, ERGs, where you are allowed that space to be able to kind of come together with people with similar backgrounds, like-minded, what have you. But that's not always available if you're in smaller places. So being able to find those safe spaces can be harder too. This is another really interesting one because we've been talking a lot about the signs that you can find in yourself. But what advice, Dr. Hill, would you have for employers, companies, supervisors, managers, leaders to recognize when an individual may be working for them may be experiencing imposter syndrome? We don't want to take advantage of employers taking advantage of employees who are just always willing to be that hard worker, putting in that extra time, et cetera. Or overcompensating for their lack of competence or confidence. So how do we kind of think about that, and what are some tips maybe for employers or managers or supervisors and kind of recognizing this in their own teammates?
Sure. I would say maybe having more clarity even around your expectations for the people who might be working under you or working with you. And I think that can sometimes help because people may feel that, okay, you're telling me this is what I'm supposed to do, but maybe there's something else I'm supposed to be doing that isn't being overtly shared. And maybe I have to go above and beyond, or else you'll mark me negatively on my next eval, et cetera. So being really clear about that, I think, is important. And I think having these conversations openly and honestly, like having maybe a staff meeting where you're talking about the imposter syndrome, maybe where you're sharing your own experiences of that whenever you were earlier in your career, or even presently. And again, normalizing that and even naming that if you can, even privately one-on-one with someone, like say, like, I've noticed you've been taking on a lot of extra work. And I just want to kind of talk to you about that. Like, what's kind of driving that force? Like, I already think you're doing a great job, but what are you doing why are you giving me 150% when I'm asking you only for 100%? Right. And I think validating that, being empathetic, and again, seeing people's humanity, I think is helpful. And knowing that they're valued, not just because they're giving you 150% all the time, but they're just inherently like valued members of your system is important.
That's great. We have another one here that I know is a toughie, but it's an important one to address. You brought up the value of 360 evaluations earlier, and somebody wrote in, if you're in an oppressive environment, how do you propose the notion of 360 evaluations or other practices or protocols and the like, and change within that environment? And, given what we talked about here around, the paradigms and systems in which we live, if that can be really difficult, and it's not a one-person job. So any advice on that, on trying to change an environment that is not giving people what they need or the space to be able to live authentically at all?
That's a great question. And I think that's so often the reality for a lot of workplaces. So like you said, it's not a one-person job. So if you can kind of use that power that's within numbers to kind of leverage your power so that you're able to kind of share that and be explicit about I'm not going to say what your demands are, but what your hopes are. And again, even speaking maybe to the voice of what it feels like to have these maybe top-down evaluations that don't really consider how supervisors may be abusing their power or misusing it whenever it comes to people who might be working under them. I think from people that I've worked with, like my friends, my colleagues who've been in those situations, I think, again, trying to have those open and honest conversations from the beginning have been really important. And finding trusted people within the work system who you feel you can share those things with is also important to kind of leverage these responses and leverage those feelings into something that feels less oppressive and feels maybe more communal and where you feel at least valued and respected as people who work there. So I think that's important.
Standing shoulder to shoulder can certainly make it a heck of a lot easier, for sure. Nakia, I'm going to ask one more, and then I'm going to have you, kind of go into the Q&A and pick a couple more here in case, and I'm giving Dr. Hill a break here in case you need a sip of water or anything, because we're putting you on the Q&A front here. But I love this one, which is, why is it so much easier for me to help a colleague to recognize and move past her own imposter syndrome, but I have so much trouble dealing with my imposter syndrome? Boy, and is that true?
Sure. Can you repeat that one more time for me?
Sure, you got it. So why is it so much easier for me to help a colleague to recognize and move past her own imposter syndrome, but I can't do the same when dealing with my own imposter syndrome?
Absolutely. Probably because you're an objective person. And most times we can be more compassionate. Often we can be kinder to other people than we can be to ourselves. And sometimes that happens. So even in therapy, oftentimes one of the interventions we'll use is, how would you talk to a friend? Like if a friend was going through this, what would you say to them? And then people are often very kind. They're really affirming. They're really encouraging. You can tell like the love and support as they say that. But then it's really hard. Like you have to intentionally imagine it's somebody else versus yourself. Because oftentimes we think, oh, it's different for me. I have to be harder on myself. I don't deserve the same grace that I would offer anyone else who's in this position. And that's just inherently not true. So I would say even pretend that it's your friend. Like even write yourself like a journal entry as if you're your friend. And if someone were telling you this information, how would you respond to them? And sometimes it has to be even that type of exercise until it becomes something that's a little bit more automatic and natural, to where you're automatically able to respond to yourself with kindness and with a lot of grace that you deserve. Yeah, but I think it's completely normal. Yeah.
No, that's fantastic advice. So Nakia, what are you seeing in the Q&A to share with Dr. Hill?
I do see a really great question about how you can use your colleagues as sort of an inspiration for yourself, as opposed to a trigger for imposter syndrome. So you have colleagues that are working really hard, they're really great at their jobs, and instead of seeing that as a goal for yourself, it's sort of, wow, like I'm not like that. So imposter. How do you rectify that?
Yeah, I think that again, that goes back to capitalism and this desire for competition and productivity versus connection, right? So with that, I think that's a natural thing that we're often all trained to do. Like, oh, I want to be happy for this person, but their success means something, says something about me, right? So it's again, how do you actually interpret other people's success? And again, does that go back to some deep-seated feeling that you might have about yourself? Right. So some ways that I've like told people to maybe work on this is to kind of develop more connection versus competition. So maybe reaching out to somebody who's maybe at the same, maybe in your same org, who has the same position as you, or to somebody who was a colleague somewhere else, and maybe just give them an affirming message. Just reach out to them and let them know that you see them, that you like what they're doing. And that's a way, I think, for you to build community and connection versus kind of having this competitive lens that we're all kind of reaching for these same resources, or that only one of us can be successful, and that's not really the case. That's kind of what we've been taught, and that isn't necessarily helpful for any of us internally. For us to feel like we can only feel tall if we're standing on top of somebody else, but it's not good just to kind of have that message generally for other people. So,
for sure. Yeah, great answer.
Good question.
So there's another question. That's sort of like back to basics a little bit. So it's how do you differentiate self-doubt and just low self-esteem, or just moments of low self-esteem, from full-blown imposter syndrome? Like what is the difference?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the research shows that they're closely correlated, at least self-esteem and imposter syndrome. And I think one thing to remember with the imposter syndrome is also this objective evidence. So you are objectively competent. Like nobody could argue with that. And I would I guess I would argue with that a little bit of how our society considers competence. I think that might it might be different for each community you're a part of and what the norms are. But maybe for somebody who has the qualifications, who has the requirements for positions, et cetera, that person still feeling like they can't internalize that, or they have to discount every single achievement they have. That's somebody we would consider somebody who's suffering from the imposter syndrome, versus somebody who just maybe has like self-esteem issues or self-doubt. But they're all closely related. And I think, again, it goes back to that internal work and that internal image we have of ourselves.
And so, so when we're talking about sort of full-on imposter syndrome, can it lead to other mental health issues like depression, or does it just end up being a symptom of depression?
Yeah, so again, definitely tied to depression, anxiety, psychological well-being generally. So especially a lot of the research that I looked at like Black women in college environments who experience imposter syndrome, that being closely related to negative mental health outcomes. It can definitely have an impact on how you feel about yourself, the symptoms that you kind of endorse. So imagine if you feel most like an imposter whenever you're in a specific classroom. Maybe the professor isn't really affirming, your classmates don't want to work with you, which I saw a lot in my research. That's going to lead to probably some anxious symptoms in the moment whenever you're in that classroom, but it also might lead to that kind of internalized kind of sadness and depression as well. And again, those feelings of low self-worth and low value because of this environment you're a part of too. So it's very closely linked to a lot of psychological constructs as well.
Right. So when we're talking about sort of not having that external sort of validation, especially from like a professor or like a boss, how do you remain compassionate to yourself? Like how do you, not take that personally and, continue to see the value in your work, even if you don't have someone explicitly telling you that you're doing great?
Yeah, I think that's so much of the life work for all of us, to be able to kind of feel like you can stand without kind of those external markers or that validation. I think that's so much of the work. I think by saying that, by having a good and strong kind of internal self-image, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to be hurt whenever your boss or your professor or whoever might do or say things that aren't affirming for you or aren't validating. It just means that maybe at the end of the day, you're able to maybe name that hurt, but also understand that that hurt doesn't belong to you. Like you don't necessarily have to be responsible for it by yourself. So I think maybe it's the balance of that.
That's really great. Nikki, I'm going to ask one more question, then see if Dr. Hill has any things that she definitely wants to leave to impart her vast wisdom with all of us tonight, because I know I've learned a lot in this session. And this goes back to where it all begins with imposter syndrome. And somebody wrote in that they work directly with young students. So we're really talking pre-K through 12 here who are already expressing feelings of impostership. Are there suggestions to help equip our kids in this nation now with tools they can learn to master for their educational journey and beyond? So how can we kind of break this cycle early on in education?
That's a great point. I would say I'm trying to think of some of the interventions I'd have for adults who are going through this. I'm sure you can tailor some of those to just younger children in a way that's age appropriate too. So again, maybe validating like, yes, you have done X, Y, or Z, and you're also great because of these other inherent qualities about you. You always share, you're always kind to your friends, etc. So making sure that they don't have their whole sense of worth or value tied to those external markers, but letting them also understand that you can objectively do certain tasks. You are qualified to do these things. And that is not all of who you are as a whole entire being. And I think starting that pretty early is important. And I know a lot of different researchers and educators are kind of shifting from that you're smart framework and you're intelligent to shifting it to a more like you worked really hard, like focusing more on the effort that's put into something versus just kind of putting a label on it as this person is smart. Because we know that that can be challenging for students when they get older. If they fail at something, again, it's tied to their sense of value and their whole entire being versus just being something that you maybe made a mistake on or didn't do as well on.
Right, totally. So, Dr. Hill, any before Nakia kind of wraps us up this evening, and I have to say, you've kind of flooded our brains with so much great information and tools and tips that kind of investigating our own selves as well as helping others and really being upstanders and partners, in my case as a supervisor, to make sure I'm rooting out and looking for those traits of imposter syndrome to allow people to continue to move forward and move forward confidently in their skills and abilities with objectivity. Any remaining things that you want to make sure and share with our audience tonight about the imposter syndrome and how to really achieve radical self-acceptance?
Absolutely. I think a couple of things that are coming to mind is to remember that it's a process. This is a journey you're on, and to continue to respond to yourself with compassion and kindness as you try to learn different ways of responding to yourself. Right? So I think sometimes what happens is people maybe understand now what imposter syndrome is. So anytime that they start to feel like an imposter, then they're going to be really critical and mean to themselves because they're not being like self-accepting and radically self-accepting, right? So how even on this journey are you practicing kindness at each moment you can go? I think for people who are curious about maybe where they fall kind of in line with this kind of scale of imposter syndrome, there is a scale that the original researchers developed, and I can send you the link in the chat. Let me do that. This is something that I usually do when I do workshops in person. I have people kind of take a couple of minutes to kind of to kind of answer some of the questions, but it kind of asks you 20 different questions. You kind of add up your score, and then you can see where you are with the range of like how frequently and how pervasive these imposter thoughts are for you. So I can share that with you all too.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. Well, while you're doing that, I just have to express our gratitude on behalf of all of us at AAUW and the Equity Network for such a rich conversation tonight. I'm so glad that Nakia reached out and that you were willing to share your expertise and your thoughts tonight. This has really been fantastic. And you'll find the link that Dr. Hill just mentioned now in the chat box. Encourage you to grab it, copy, and paste it into your own server or Google search so that you can take a look at it. And I am going to turn it over to Nakia to wrap us up this evening.
Right, and thank you all so much for coming out for this important conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Hill, for sharing your wealth of knowledge on this topic. I'm sure you helped a ton of people tonight. I definitely feel like I have a lot of tips that I can apply to my own life. So following this webinar, you'll probably see, if you haven't already, a link to donate to the Equity Network. We appreciate your support, and it helps us to continue putting together these kinds of programs and having folks like Dr. Hill join us for these really helpful conversations. So anything that you can donate at this time will be greatly appreciated. I will follow up probably tomorrow with a survey and a message. Please let us know what you thought of this webinar by responding to that survey. It really is helpful. It's the best way for us to make sure that these programs are tailored to what you need for your professional development and just for your everyday education. So I appreciate it if you can take the survey when you receive it tomorrow. Also, I do appreciate Dr. Hill for sort of reminding us that, you know, being kind to yourself and being gentle with yourself is a practice. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. It happens over the course of a lifetime, and that was sort of my big takeaway from this webinar. And so I just wanted to reiterate that before we close out for the evening. So again, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Kim. Thank you so much, Dr. Hill. I hope everyone has a safe evening. Vote and have a good night.
Thank you all. Thanks, Dr. Hill. Good night.
Thank you so much.